Let's do another episode of Raw Reflections where I, Keaton Wyndham, a conservative who is from the South, is reflecting on my experience as a grad student in a super liberal, not only graduate program, but it's in a liberal state as well. So last week was week 6, um, and we have finally reached week 7, which week 7 is all about sexuality, religion, and the law. Uh, it was very interesting just because, a Southern Christian, sex and religion has always been so closely tied for me. I hate that it got kind of swept to the end of the course in week 7 because anyone who's been in grad school knows that most graduate school classes have that final project at the end. And so the content for that week is more like a throwaway content, something to like fill in that hole instead of really like focusing on having great conversation. Although I do think that some of my classmates and I ended up making the best of it. So at this point in the class, I ended up I went into the week with a perfect score. And I guess I was kind of preparing myself because I knew that this was going to be a bit of a sticky situation to navigate. And that definitely was true. I'm glad I prepared adequately for that. Uh, this week, everyone in the class had to submit a Q&A video question. There have been two other points throughout that 7 weeks where I had to submit a question to my professor. And so with it being the last week, I really just took the time to ask her, as someone who is a practicing mental health clinician, uh, talking about sex on a regular basis, I said, is there some kind of beginner's toolkit that you recommend? Like if I said, hey, after all this is said and done, I want to practice sex therapy in my area. What should I have when I get started? And she unfortunately didn't really answer that question for me. Um, she kind of revisited some of the older things that she said throughout class were like a 3D printed model of a clitoris because that is where all of female genital pleasure comes from, and both internal and external. Um, and then because she is like a pelvic floor expert, she was saying, those anatomical 3D models that you find in doctor's offices are super expensive, but she highly recommends it just because the pelvic floor is so important for pain and also pleasure and even like when you go through menopause and what the muscles are in control of is super all encompassing for a woman, which I didn't know before. I really appreciate all of that information she has given me over this course. Um, but then she really kind of opened it back up to us and was like, if y'all have anything y'all would love to share, that'd be great. And so uh, we we as students kind of shared links to books and stuff. Um, but she did say I have been meaning to put together kind of a resources toolkit list, and this just reaffirms that, and I really need to do that. Um, and so all of us were like, yes, yes, sign me up for this list. When you compile it, I want a copy. Because I mean, I'm never gonna turn down a more experienced professional's take or opinion on something, even if that doesn't mean, even if that means I'm not going to follow it to the letter. That is one of the beautiful things about working in mental health, is that there's a lot of room for like individuality, which is why making sure that you fit with your counselor or your therapist is such an important part of the process. Um, so hopefully she comes out with that list someday and I can share that with you guys. Uh, but so the lecture in general covered really mainly the concept of like sexual coercion, um, which, which is like an umbrella for sexual harassment, aggression, and abuse. There, to me, isn't much to say on that. That those concepts vary from state to state. You need to know your state law. Um, but that means we should skip right to, oh, quick note. My final presentation got turned in. You know, we've been talking about how I've been working on a presentation for ADHD in bed and how neurodiversity and having attention deficit hyperactivity disorder or hyperactive disorder, whichever, however fancy you're feeling, um, how that kind of neurodiversity can affect your experience in the bedroom and sexual situations. There we go. Um, I am not gonna like have a full-blown discussion about it in this video. What I'm gonna do instead is right on the heels of this video, I'll post another video that is my presentation, because it is a cool little 15-minute screen recording that I submitted as a training module for my classmates. And I got awesome feedback on it. They, another therapist, which this was the biggest compliment, and because she seemed so impressive all course long. She was very, very woke. So like I kind of steered clear of her work in like responding to it, but everything she said just felt so smart and so sharp. Even though we didn't have the same opinion, but she responded to it and she was like, oh my gosh, this was honestly so informative and so amazing that this should be turned into a continuing education credit. Like more mental health professionals and more sex educators need to understand this connection. And like, I didn't know what to do with myself. I was just, like, that just makes you feel good when something that you're interested in and that you've worked really hard on, like, somebody sees that and affirms it and says, you know, yes, I'm knowledgeable and work in this same arena too, and bravo, like, great job. It hits a little different than when someone like your husband is like, yeah, this is really great. This sounds so smart. You did a good job. Because my husband did watch it and he did tell me, you know, you're so smart and this sounds very smart and professional, and I'm not surprised because you were smart and professional. Um, but he's saying that as, you know, as a teaching pastor and as an administrator and an educator, not as like a sex positive mental health professional. So I will share that with you guys on my channel after this video. Which for the record, I got a perfect score on my final also. So no shock there. My current event, so you know, every other week I think, no, every week we've been doing a current event journal. And with it being connected to religion and law, I immediately knew what current event was going to pop up the most. And it is the concept of the Methodist Church having that big split. Um, And it was like, I wanted to write about it, but I knew that it was going to get me in trouble. So I really had to think, you know, how far am I willing to go? And ultimately, I decided that, the news outlet that is covering it the most is CNN, and they are more woke and left leaning. And so it was very like pro LGBT. And so that is the article that I chose, was a CNN article. And I just prepared myself for the fact that I was not going to get as high of a grade as I was used to. I still made an A, but I think I just barely made an A. And I think the only reason that is because my writing is so high quality, um, that I was really just counted off for on my opinion, which I wasn't shocked about. I'm not going to fight that. I know what I signed up for. I know where I am. Um, but I wanted to write about that because I actually, last year, before I even got into this program, kind of got to sit on the sidelines and watch this play out, like pretty up close and personal, because one of my coworkers had several conversations with me about it because she was Methodist, or she is Methodist, and the Methodist Church was in the middle of taking like the official vote on it at her church last year. And so the in case you are unfamiliar with this concept, the Methodist Church was really at odds about being supportive of LGBTQ and those matters, and having homosexual clergy and things of that nature. And so the religion, or the denomination, really started to kind of butt heads, and it was being destructive. And so they decided, we'll vote on it. And so every United Methodist Church voted on the concept, all of its members. That the Methodists remind me of like more casual Catholics, in the sense that like they've got a lot of laws and routines and structures in place, and so they did it pretty efficiently. And so they took all these votes from all the members, and then they submitted the votes to their like Methodist council. And there was actually a Methodist convention where representatives of the areas went and like represented those votes. And obviously they ultimately voted in favor of, being pro LGBT and having gay clergy and things like that. So what they decided to do instead was, um, those that were in support of it remained United Methodist Church members and kept that name, and those that were not supportive of it, took the word United out of the names of their churches. So, like, I'll make up a church name. Maybe it could exist, but if it was like United Methodist Church of Dallas, well, if they were against the vote, they had the option to take it out, and then their name was just Methodist Church of Dallas. Or maybe they took that opportunity to do a whole rebrand and, you know, call it Methodist Church of West Dallas, or Methodist Church of Highland Park, or Highland Park Methodist Church. That's a subdivision of Dallas. It's bougie. But so I reported on what the article said, and then in the analysis of it, I really did more of a critique than a connection to the literature, just because it was very one-sided, and I felt like that had to be addressed and it needed to be called out, and like that was not good journalism. My bachelor's is in communications and journalism, and they only spoke to people who were on the side of support. No one against the topic. They didn't get their side of the argument. They didn't want to hear their thoughts or opinions, and so I was like, that's terrible journalism, to be very clear. It's very biased. And in the journalism, they made it seem like such a simplistic process, and like everyone was on board, and Christians are supposed to be loving and accepting, and if we're not accepting the homosexual community, then we're not being Christ-like, um, and I was just like, that you make it sound like the people who are in disagreement are absolute hateful, fear-mongering bullies, and it was a much more complex issue than that, because I know that the people on the other side, because of this Methodist coworker and friend that I have, who was explaining it to me, and was taking the time to ask me questions of like, you know, why do people disagree? Like, I know other denominations like aren't having this conversation because they don't agree. Um, it was much more complex than that. Um, and those that are disagreeing aren't doing it because they're hateful. They're doing it because they love God and they are trying to be obedient followers of Christ. And if the Bible is the Word of God and it is God breathed, and it says in the Bible that homosexuality is condemned, then they're just trying to be obedient, and they show that they're faithful, and they show that they love God and that they love people by being obedient to the Bible. And I know there are people who have said, well, that's not loving to not support LGBT. And I have heard, the side that doesn't support really give a great analogy here recently, when in a video that I was watching, where they said, like, I love my siblings. I love my friends. I would not lie to my friends if they asked me about something. If they said, hey, should I get my hair cut like this? Hey, what do you think of this dress or, this shirt? If you lie to them, that's not being loving. You might feel like you're protecting their feelings, but then you're ultimately sending them out into the world to experience hurt and discomfort from a stranger who doesn't take their feelings into account. When you, as their sibling, as their friend, could communicate with them in a loving and honest manner to try to protect them. Because if you felt like you knew the truth, which Christians that do not condone homosexuality believe that they know the truth, why would they lie to these people that they love if they believe that the consequences are that they would die and go to hell? And so they're trying to love them through honesty, just like a parent loves a child through tough love. And I wish that they would have communicated that nuance in that article instead of just doing the liberal, like, emotional terrorism of, broad brushing the issue and being like, well, we're loving because we support everyone, obviously, and those that don't support everyone hate them. And it gave me a migraine, to be frank. and I dreaded submitting it. I'm surprised that I didn't get more points counted off because of how woke my professor is. But I I tried not to infuse my own personal feelings, but I mean, it was a critique, not a connection to the literature, and I'll give her that all day long. That's fine. Um, I will share that link in the video description though. So, we have talked about my assignment, we've talked about the current event, talked about the Q&A, talked about the lecture. All that is left is the discussion board and the readings. Um, but before I get into those, I really just want to, I guess, immortalize or have a record of the fact that I have been so pleasantly surprised at how this class and these conversations about sex and sexuality and religion have really kind of presented opportunities to talk to people about the Bible and about God and the gospel, because being married to someone like my husband who teaches the Bible on a weekly basis, and he has hundreds and hundreds of people who consume his content, and he specializes in theology and church history and apologetics, and he's getting a degree, a whole PhD in Bible exposition. Like, they go to him. They don't go to me. They don't go to the therapist who specializes in autism and sex therapy. I mean, and so, but I've had so many people who have approached me with things like this United Methodist like church split issue, because they don't know my husband, but they know me. And something about me has somehow communicated to them that, like, I know my Bible, and not only do I know my Bible, but like, I am more than just a cultural Christian, and I have a relationship with Christ. And I had that coworker approach me and say, "Hey, Keaton, I've got a question about the Bible, and I know that you would know it." And I was like, "Oh, you you think so? I appreciate the confidence. Like, let's hear it." And it was a question about baptism. And I was like, I do actually know this. Okay, like, we can have a conversation about it. And they express gratitude and appreciation because they feel too intimidated to talk to people who are in ministerial roles and positions, and who are experts like my husband. But and so they act so appreciative to speak to me, but I'm just as appreciative of them for implying that they think that I not only have the head knowledge but the heart knowledge, and that I'm a reliable source, and that I know what I'm talking about, because they can tell that I have a deep, meaningful personal relationship with Christ. Am I perfect? Absolutely not. Um, do I have all the answers? Absolutely not. Um, but they trust that I'm gonna be as honest and approachable about it as I can. And so I I have loved how much this program has already like created these opportunities, and that's part of the reason why I wanted to go through this program, is because I want to be that bridge. So, just a little side quest of a thought. Um, so let me switch my notes out, friends. Um, so I'm gonna kind of mix the topics of the weekly readings and the discussion board together because they are so closely connected. Um, because sometimes the discussion board, I choose to like apply it to me personally. That's always an option when answering the discussion board. Um, the question, one of the questions that I decided to answer was, in what ways does the information from this module match your own life experiences? That's always an option, and that's just what I chose this week. Feel free to discuss how the information from this module does not match your life experiences as well. And how can you use this information to apply it to your own future professional endeavors? Um, the readings this week that I wanted to touch on and that I included in my discussion board were talking about how religion and morality share like its view of like porn use and its effects on society and people, um, and about how sexting has both clinical and legal implications. And then there was an article called Sexual Health and Religion Primer. And I know I'm just listing these off right now. We're going to circle back. And then the Abstinence Only Until Marriage review of policies, programs, and impacts. So, abstinence only until marriage is also referred to as AOUM. And so I decided in my discussion board that I was going to really hone in on the AOUM and the religion primer and and really kind of talk about those. And so I gave my background on my parents being really involved in church and having leadership roles and being really sheltered. Um, excuse me. And so uh, I will read to you my discussion board, although some of this information is going to kind of be a refresher from what I've said before. I said this week's material hits very close to home. I was raised very involved in church, have worked for religious organizations, and my husband has held several ministerial positions at churches. With my parents being in positions of leadership in church, my siblings and I were often held to the same expectations as the pastor's kids as a result of good parenting at every stage of a kid's life. I was only taught the abstinence only until marriage, or AOUM model, and while I did abide by its teachings until I was married, the article discussing it on our readings put data to many complaints I've had about it for years. I appreciated the connection it made to adolescents having a right to sexual health knowledge and education in order to facilitate informed consent. When each of us turned 13, my siblings and I made a commitment to wait until marriage for sex. As an adult, I often describe that moment as signing a contract without reading it. I had no business agreeing to that when I had no concept of sex. It also put me in situations I didn't know how to navigate in my teens and early 20s because I didn't possess the same exposure to sex education as my peers. I had not previously known about the fact that while the marital age has gone up, the age of a first sexual encounter has remained the same. It blew my mind to consider that the AOUM was actually counterproductive because it implicitly polices information flow and behaviors. So, basically, I feel like the AOUM model really just was trying to keep kids in the dark, but releasing us out into the real world put us on the front lines of a battle without a weapon to like defend ourselves with. And I feel like I've described it like that pretty regularly because that's not fair to put religious kids who are trying to do the right thing and follow the Bible and have a personal relationship with Christ out here defenseless when non-religious kids are more educated than us. They can, you know, do circles around us and really twist us up and confuse us. And I mean, we don't have the tools to argue our personal stances. Um, so then it said, my ultimate goal after taking these courses is to work with churches to teach parents how to educate their children about sex and make sex and relationship therapy seem more accessible to a conservative church audience. I appreciate the Sexual Health and Religion primer because it's important that mental health professionals like myself understand religion's history and stances in regards to sexuality and sex education in order to appropriately treat the individuals I may work with. I was a little disappointed that the article covered most of the major religions but skipped the Protestant stance. It's possible the writer assumed that Catholicism and sexuality section was similar enough to Protestants that it could be left out. However, as a Protestant, I knew before reading the article that the two groups differ both in theological and moral sexual aspects. This highlighted how important it can be to truly understand the community you desire to serve, because someone less religious probably does not know the nuances inherently involved. The article is still so rich in information that I saved it for future use. Um, and that was another huge thing. That Sexual Health and Religion primer listed all of like the major like biggest religions. It was like the top 7 or 10. But they left out Protestantism and they included Catholicism. And I was like, this is not the same. And if you are a Protestant or if you are a Catholic, if you're honest about it, then you would agree with what I'm saying. There are some people who don't know the differences who would go, oh, we're all brothers and sisters in Christ. But like, we're truly different enough that when you look at the tenets of belief and what goes into our belief, that if you knew better, you wouldn't say that. But there are other people in my class who are from like the Middle East and who are Muslims and things like that. And they were so intrigued by that statement I made that they actually responded to me and said, hey, I actually didn't know that there were theological and like sexual moral differences between Protestants and Catholics. Like, could you tell me some of that? Like, what are those differences that like that had never occurred to me before? And so it actually created another one of those cool moments that I was talking about where I could use that moment to talk about the Bible and talk about God and my beliefs and like what Christianity entails in a positive light. Um, and so I got to explain how like the Pope um, speaks as like God, as God's mouthpiece basically for the Catholic Church, and how he is the head of the church, and he is this mediator, and people confess their sins to him, and that has to be done regularly. And Catholicism is more works based than Protestantism, whereas Protestants believe that the Bible is the ultimate authority, not the Pope, and that we have personal relationships. We don't need to confess our sins to a priest. We can go to the Lord in prayer, and because we are his children, he hears our prayers and he answers them, and he forgives our sins when we ask for forgiveness with a true, earnest heart and desire. And I said, and like sexually and morally, a huge difference is the concept of birth control. Catholics don't believe in birth control, and um, depending on what denomination of Protestantism, birth control is okay. Um, because I come from a big family, and I remember when my last sibling was born, I had ladies who worked at my elementary school who asked me if we were Catholic. And I was like, what? What does that even mean? Uh, because I am one of 5 siblings. And I was like, no, I go to a Bible church or I go to a Baptist church. Like, I don't understand what you're asking. And they were like, oh, never mind, never mind. And I went home and told my parents, and my parents laughed because they were like, Catholics don't believe in taking birth control. They don't believe in like the prevention of pregnancy. Although there are plenty of Catholics who do not follow that rule. That is the official like Catholic stance. Um, and so it was this really cool moment where I got to share with my friends in the Middle East and my friends who have only grown up in the Muslim community, or there were a lot of students who left Mormonism, who were raised as like LDS Mormons. And so like I was talking about a concept they had no prior knowledge of. So that was really cool. Um, so the next part of my discussion board says the article Context Matters was a great reminder that it's important to know a client's views on a subject before discussing them in detail. Being commonly surrounded by more religious people means that my default is to think of porn's more negative aspects and consequences. My husband is an accountability partner for someone who identifies as a porn addict. They asked my husband to use a program on the computer that blocks sites and would notify my husband if he ever turns it off or searches for porn. This kind of struggle and accountability is the most common way I hear porn discussed in my religious circles. However, I've had a handful of discussions with non religious friends who casually discuss porn usage like it's no big deal and have never seemed to have a problem with it. After reading the article, I tend to agree that when you turn something into a boogeyman, you automatically give it this fear based power over you. So that was in reference to um, the reading of how religion and morality share porn use and its effects. Um, and the religious communities treat porn like it is the boogeyman. And this is not me promoting porn. We've already kind of had this conversation in other videos. Um, I do not think it's appropriate. Um, I don't think it's something you should be looking at, just because of my religious biblical beliefs. Um, I think stuff of such a sexually explicit nature should not be interacted with. If you are being sexual in nature, and you're married, then what you and your spouse get up to together in your bedroom is your business. But I don't even condone porn usage shared among a married couple. That is my personal professional opinion. But as we know in therapy, personal professional opinions are kind of like armpits. Everyone has one and they don't all look the same. Um, so, with that being said, I do think that because the religious communities talk about it like it's such a huge taboo and it's only horrible and it's only bad, like we're constantly drawing attention to it and like making people interested in it by talking about how extremely awful it is, that I think in a certain extent it's actually intriguing people to go look. And it's intrinsically giving it this like boogeyman final boss level, like up on a pedestal kind of power. Um, because my, less religious friends, those who are just like culturally conservative or like culturally moral, but not really Christian friends. Um, I know that some of them have even just discussed with me casually, like in passing, like, oh yeah, sometimes I watch it, or I've watched it before. It's not for me. It's not a big deal. Or they'll say like, yeah, I mean, every once in a while I'll watch it. You know, I don't do it all the time, or like I only do it like if my husband's out of town or my wife is out of town, and I am trying to scratch an itch or something like that. But the way they talk about it so casually, for like, really catches you off guard the first couple times. I'm not gonna lie. I'm like, I'm sorry. Are we talking about what I think we're talking about? Because like, why do you think I want to have this casual kind of conversation without warning? Like, prepare me, my guy. And honestly, if you're a dude and we're not sitting in my office, you're not asking me a professional like question about it, like an academic, don't walk up to me and just start sharing. Like, some people do that. They just start sharing about their like kinks and fetishes and like stuff they get up to. And I'm like, mm-mm, I don't need that running through my brain. No, thank you. It's different if you have a question. I am always willing to answer a question, but do not regale me with tales of what you get up to if there's no point to it. I've got enough going on in my own day-to-day life. I don't want that. Um, but the way they talk about it so casually, you can tell it has no power over them, or um, it at least doesn't like consume their thoughts the way that religious people talk about it. And it could just be that they are fooling themselves and they are delusional. But the people who I have known well enough to actually have a conversation about it, they rarely engage in it. And I feel like part of the reason that is because they're not making it this huge like monster under the bed. And I feel like to a certain extent the Christian community really has turned that into a monster for Christian men specifically. Like, oh, watch out for porn. Oh, we're not talking about sex. We're not looking at girls. Modest is hottest. Don't even hold hands with a girl. Don't kiss a girl. And like they're trying to numb you sexually, and almost to the point to where like, where else are they gonna see it if they don't go looking for it on the internet? But then you get double the shame and double the judgment, because they're like, oh, I can't believe you as a Christian man were looking at porn. Well, I mean, you won't tell us anything about sex growing up. So how are they supposed to know what things look like? How are they supposed to know what things are called? How are they supposed to get their information? I'm not supportive of gathering your information that way. I'm just saying, curiosity eventually kills the cat. Um, and so I always think it's so interesting to see how like guilt ridden Christians are about certain topics compared to non-Christian people, although my husband would turn it into a conversation about like depravity and how, you know, we feel so guilty because we know what's right and what's wrong, and it's a conviction of our souls and of our conscience, um, whereas the other people are having more of what we refer to as like a Romans 1 issue, where they have been given over to their depravity, and so they don't see anything wrong with it. Um, so it's a very interesting, nuanced conversation at our house, as you can tell by me like kind of playing both sides. Because we this is one of the conversations that we will have. We love to talk about these kinds of thoughts and how they interact with each other. Um, well, that is it for the final week of my first class. I really loved this class, and I think I ended up with a 98. I went into the week with a perfect score, and I was no holds barred, honestly. Um, and it was totally worth it. I don't regret standing up for myself, and I I wasn't prepared for it to happen so many times in one week when it rarely happened the first six. But I mean, I felt more affirmed in my reasons why I wanted to go into this program to begin with. Um, because I would have hated to have been saying, I want to go into this program so that I can have these conversations and, represent and, be this bridge, and then have like stumbled and busted my face and totally tried to avoid these conversations. I would have felt like a dum dum. But the next class that I'm going to kind of reflect on is my law and policy class. So you will see that week 1 video soon. The video right after this one, the true final video of this playlist for my Intro to Sexuality class, will be my final project. It's that 15-minute presentation on how ADHD affects your sexual encounters. So, in the meantime, like, subscribe, follow along. It is a wild ride, I can assure you. And I am Keaton Wyndham. This was Raw Reflections. See you next time.